set up? All right. We do our mic. All right, quick audio check. Can those online hear? Good deal. All right. This is a public meeting subject to public meeting law. This meeting is being streamed live on DPSST YouTube page. It will be recorded in the form of minutes. Discussion of issues will be conducted by the work group members only. Please be mindful of comments and side conversations. This is the Criminal Justice Moral Fitness Work Group. The day is May 6, 2024. The time is 10:04. We're physically located here at DPSST on Amsville Highway in Salem, and then we'll also have folks joining us remotely by Teams. So we will go around the room, so those online know who's in the room for introductions, and then we'll call out those who are signed in online. So starting, Jennifer Howell, DPSST.
Catherine Kelpine, DPSST.
Sheriff Angela Brennefer, PPC Committee.
Mark Daniel, I represent OACP and the PTC.
Les Youngbar, Public.
Carol Deshawn, Oregon Department of Corrections.
Cindy Park, DPSST.
Kathy Fink, DPSST.
Melissa Langbacho, DPSST.
Rob Wood, PPC number.
Samantha Cosa, DPSST.
And then joining us online, we have Jessica Beach with OACCD. We have Mark Boren, public member of the Policy Committee meeting. We have Scotty Nowning from the board and the Police Policy Committee. And we have Erica Stolhan from Hood River Sheriff's Office. Did I miss anybody? Jennifer Lavario from DPSST. That's kind of everybody. Thank you all so much for joining us. So we will kick off the agenda. First item on the list are the ineligibility periods. So I'm going to go through some of the information that's captured in the memo because it really outlines our discussion points going forward. And that is, an ineligibility period is the time frame that the person has to wait before they can come back to the profession. So when the committee or when the rule requires that the certification be denied or revoked, that action is final and permanent, but there's an ineligibility period for the discretionary denials and revocations. And once that ineligibility period passes, then a person could seek reemployment and certification in public safety again. So the denial or revocation of certification and the ineligibility period apply to all public safety professional disciplines. So the example there is that a parole and probation officer could not be revoked and then go seek employment as a telecommunicator and get certified as a telecommunicator before that ineligibility period passed, because it applies to all disciplines. Again, our mandatory denial revocations are lifetime and they're permanent, and there's no request for reconsideration on those. For the cases that go to our applicant review committee, those are pre-employment criminal disposition reviews. So they're discretionary, and so a denial for pre-employment criminal dispositions, they have a ineligibility period range of 0 days up to 10 years. And the ineligibility period would start from the date of the criminal disposition. So sometimes that will result in cases where the finding is that there should be a denial, but the ineligibility period time has already lapsed. But there's still the action to deny because it is found to be a moral fitness violation. Let's see. For the policy committee cases, those going to corrections, police, and telecommunications, those are, again, the discretionary cases. The ineligibility period for a discretionary denial or revocation ranges from a minimum of 3 years up to a maximum of lifetime. So when it is misuse of authority or misconduct, it's the 3 years to 10 years. If the misconduct includes discriminatory conduct, or if there's a finding of dishonesty, that can go up to the lifetime ineligibility period. And there's currently no path to reconsideration on those discretionary ineligibility periods. One of the other things that we'll review is that we have 3 different effective dates for those ineligibility periods depending upon the circumstance for the cases that go to the committees. When it's a criminal disposition, it begins from the date of the criminal disposition. If it's a separation of employment, then it goes back to the date of the separation of employment. But there's a third category that seeks to address when a person has been separated but regains employment and has been employed during the case review process. So there hasn't been any true separation of employment. They've gone on to other employment. And then the ineligibility period begins on the day the board approves the action. So let's see, the final note is that a person who has been denied or revoked for the discretionary moral fitness violations can reapply for training and certification when that ineligibility period has been satisfied. All right.
And if I could just add one thing to draw your attention, in the last couple months, if you've noticed, if you sat on any of your committees, we've tried to put that in the staff report that should the committee recommend action, when would it? So again, because we know that there are different times that the rules can apply, we've tried to at least put that in the staff report now to give all of you that information right up front.
So recently, or over the past several meetings, policy members have expressed a need to consider changes to the minimum ineligibility period. So that's for the Telecommunications, Corrections, and Police Policy Committee, that minimum of 3 years. And then policy committee members and DPSST staff have expressed a need to reevaluate the effective dates of the ineligibility period. Managing those 3, always trying to balance when what circumstance applies, and sometimes when there are 2 circumstances, such as a separation and a criminal disposition, which one takes the precedent. So we want to try to clean that up a little bit through our discussions today. If there are any preliminary questions, I'd be happy to answer preliminary questions. Otherwise, our first posted question is, should the policy committees, TPC, CPC, and PPC, have an option for an ineligibility period that is less than the current minimum of 3 years? And what would it be?
I actually think we should entertain 0 years. And the reason for that is there could be a moral fitness violation that if we decide not to take action is kind of not sustaining the action itself if we decide not to take action, but we did think there was a moral fitness violation, although minor. And depending, this is interesting when you said the times, the ineligibility period commences. That's very helpful for me. It seems like in that they're penalized if they seek employment, like they go from certified police officer to telecommunications, and then we review the case 2 years later. It seems like they're penalized because now we're starting that ineligibility period, not from the date of the separation. If I hear that correctly, we're starting it from when the committee and board makes that decision.
Only if they went directly into, so if I were fired from agency A, or I separated from agency A, but I had a professional standards case and agency B hired me 3 months later, and I've been working for the past 1.5 years while my case was being prepared and presented to the policy committee, because I was working for that 1.5 years, it would be the board approval date, recognizing that I had never been separated from public safety. So that one of the concepts in the past has been that the ineligibility period helps recorrect that public trust in the certification by separating that individual from being able to serve the public.
Correct, but that might support proposal to go to 0 years if the moral fitness violation occurred because they're on the streets, but couldn't occur as a telecommunicator. Now we've imposed something, so I'd like to hear from other people, but I think if we had 0 years in a case like that, it could be, I would look at it as time served. You've been off the street for whatever. By the time it comes to us as a committee, I mean, some of these are 2 and 3 years old. We've had one recently, and I struggled with that because I definitely felt there was a moral fitness violation, but I also felt that the time imposed was a little strict because I think enough time had elapsed. Yeah. Sheriff, Chief.
So it would be Sheriff Vandenberg for the record. So it would be, what you're saying is that it's a finding, yet a stay of the sentence, for lack of a better term. So that it's a recognition, but is this only an instance where someone goes from, say, police officer to telecommunicator, or what if they went to one police agency to another police agency?
I think that could happen too, but then that might change my opinion of the revocation period depending on what they're doing.
So in that particular case, it was a mitigating factor that they were in a different discipline.
Right, and
And
we've
doing
had people
different
go
duties.
we've had people go from police to corrections, and that technically takes them out of a arrest situation.
I don't know about that. I'm not sure I can, last year, for the record, that's one I probably couldn't go for because you're putting them in another position of tremendous amount of trust dealing with prisoners, so I'd struggle with that, but I get your other point.
Yeah, and I know we're not supposed to bring it up, but there's a current case we're reviewing right now in the PPC that I think this applies to, so.
Sorry.
I think as a committee member, it's not easy, but it's easier to determine whether there's a moral fitness violation. Where I struggle with is the second part, the revocation period and consistency between all the cases.
So adjusting the ineligibility period allows the committee to find the moral fitness violations, to recommend revoking current certifications or denying the ability to be certified, being able to prescribe anywhere from 1 day up to the 10 years or the lifetime, depending upon what the projected ineligibility date time frame would be. That would be a consideration. Other disciplines would be a consideration. The certification is still revoked or denied. The person would have to continue to go through a new application process once the ineligibility period is satisfied. So are there enough circumstances or mitigating factors where sometimes it needs to be less than 3 years?
Is this prescribed by OAR?
Yes.
Okay, so this is, we're a recommendation committee, that this,
Yes.
nothing can happen.
Right, so the discussion will be formulated, based on consensus of the group, and then that would go to the policy committees and a proposed rule change, and then all the way up through the board. Yeah. We have Scotty online.
Hey, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Hey, so I'm gonna second Rob's concern because I'm on the same committees as him, and so we have these cases where you can have someone where it's a much more minor violation, but it is a violation. But our only choice, if we find there's a violation, is really the 3 years, and that could put it in a position where someone's going to lose their job now, even though now that they've moved on. It's been a couple of years, and an agency has done their due diligence and has accepted whatever this situation was as acceptable for them to be in that position. Also, the other community member also had some concerns about being in another position of trust. I think the boards are extremely thorough in their evaluation of these cases, And it's been my experience so far that you really do take a holistic approach on, what is this person's history? What have they done since then? What is the nature of the violation, and what could happen in the future when we make those decisions? So I agree with Rob. There needs to be, even if it's for the 10% of the cases where these would apply, it really puts us in a tough position where maybe we would find no violation, maybe because we know we're not going to have an option to give less than 3 years, if that makes sense.
Kathy McAlpine for the record. I just want to share with you, as I still continue to grow in this position, talking to other committee members, usually at debriefing after one of the committees meet. And I've heard on a couple of occasions where they really struggled because their desire was to do something less than 3 years. And so some have opted just then say, I don't find moral fitness because I don't want to go 3 years. And they really struggle with that. So I told them that you guys were all meeting and I would share their concerns to all of you, that there are those circumstances where they would like at least to be able to have the option of less than 3 years to still find sustain a moral fitness violation, but have some options as to a less egregious time.
Jennifer, Les Dunbar. I do get the point, actually, now that you've kind of clarified it for me, about having the option. It doesn't take away my belief in the trust part, but also means we're just placing a great deal of trust in the committees, who are professionals, to review these and then just pick an appropriate time, which I think I would be okay with that. Whether that's 0 or months or
2 years
2 or 3 years.
As Scotty brought up, we're limited to 3 years.
Yeah.
We had a case last time that part of the mitigating material that was in the case was number of letters in support of the person who had later moved on to a different agency, and that new agency was writing tons of letters of support after a long period of time had elapsed. And had we imposed the 3 years, they would have lost their job at that point. And I know it's our job, it's our diligence to protect the public, but it's also our job to protect these people's careers if we see that as appropriate.
And Kathy McAlpine, for the record, just reiterating what you were saying is part of that totality of the circumstances. There are people who don't jump right in from one discipline to another. There is that break, perhaps growth, life-changing appreciation, then they go seeking it. But because their moral fitness was deferred and they're coming up now, that's when the committees will hear it. So sometimes there are. So I think there are just a few of the circumstances that Jennifer laid out where somebody could actually leave one profession and go before it gets caught up with them. More often than not, it's usually a different discipline where you're faced with that continuous employment.
And then just another thing to consider is that when certification is revoked, it does stay on the DPSST training record on the certifications as revoked. That never gets changed. So when that ineligibility period passes and they do get hired and they do apply for certification, that's a whole new certification, but the revoked certification never goes away. The record of the revoked certification never goes away. It's always there.
So what a revocation of Sheriff Brandenburg of 0 days. So it would be a recognition of the conduct was worthy of revocation, but yet they were never revoked, but it's on the record.
But they are revoked. The ineligibility of 1 day means that they can turn around and reapply.
So if somebody goes from one agency to another, it's revoked, would they have to reapply? What is the steps that person would have to do to maintain their job?
Right, yes. So once the certification is revoked, denied or revoked, the person would have to, if they are not employed, when they are reemployed, they would have to meet all of the minimum, once the ineligibility period is passed. So if you revoked on Wednesday and said it was a 30-day ineligibility period, well, it would depend on if it was from the date of we'll say a criminal disposition because that's easy. For a criminal disposition, it goes back to the date of the criminal disposition. That was 2 years ago, so that's already passed. So it means that by the time we finish all of the paperwork, they can just go through the reapplication process. Meaning, here's a new F7 application for my certifications, those types of things. So there's not, in that scenario, there's not a retraining.
But the impact to the agency, the employee agency, is that person's not currently certified, would have to be pulled off. Or depending on where they're working at, let's just say in the police agency, they would technically not be certified, they'd have to reapply to be certified.
Correct.
In that particular, Rob Wood for the record, I'm sorry I haven't been doing that.
Sure.
In that particular instance, yes, but what happens if there is a criminal disposition, they resigned in lieu of 2 years, they're hired at another agency, and we come back with 1 year of revocation period. So they were hired after the revocation period expired. Would they still have to, in that case, reapply?
Yes.
They would?
Yes.
Okay.
Because the revocation takes the certification away.
But it took it away and put it,
It takes the certification away forever.
thank you.
They have.
And that's why we have the ineligibility period
Okay.
as a separate finding. So
Okay.
we're gonna take your action, when you take action against the certification and you revoke it, that is forever. We revoke it forever.
I see.
You never get that back.
Thank
Get a
you.
new one.
But after ineligibility, after that, that time period has passed, then the person can meet all of the requirements to be employed and certified again. So if they're currently certified, if they're currently employed by an agency, it would just default to that agency's employment practices and how they assign that person before there's a certification. But in that scenario, it wouldn't be any different than the new person that you've hired and brought in. They're still a police officer or a corrections officer on the day that you bring them in. They just have to come to DPSST to get their training and then apply for certification if it was a brand new person. So that certification has been revoked. There becomes a timeline by which they would have to be recertified. That time clock starts over just like a new person would.
But they would be deployed, Sheriff Brandenburg for the record,
Yes.
deployed, let's just say they work
Yes.
patrol.
Yes,
But they're working patrol without being certified,
correct.
which would be a problem for the agency until the F7, everything came through.
Sure.
I see what you're saying, because it's different from a person who's hired and needs to obtain their certification versus someone that you're employing and sending out whose certification has been revoked.
Because you're not sending a new recruit out
Yeah,
by themselves
Right.
and doing the thing, so that would be, and anyway, just.
right. I see the headline, yes, officer
We're going above that.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I don't see this as I don't see this as a lot of cases.
No,
So I think this would be not the norm, this would probably be less than
I
5% or
think
something.
that already exists though, because if an agency is willing to take a risk on someone, they're fully aware of their background or the background check. They're willing to take that because if the F4 showed that there was a moral fitness or potential moral fitness, that agency knows they're gonna come before us eventually. So I think that risk already exists. It's just now, it's possible that it would just be a revocation and a reapplication the next day instead of a revocation and you've lost that person for a long time. Is that correct?
I think so.
Kathy McCullough, for the record, a couple times I've seen this scenario, and I'll certainly ask Jennifer or Melissa to correct me if I'm wrong or add anything more, but there are scenarios where an individual left, so resigned prior to the completion of an investigation, went and got hired, maybe in the same discipline, maybe in a different public safety discipline, and by the time this case makes its way through and let's just say there was enough to bring it forward to a committee for a moral fitness finding, so that you could have that scenario where somebody left prior to the investigation ever being completed, got hired, maybe in the same discipline, maybe in another public safety discipline, and now it's coming before the committee and if they decide to take action, they could be currently employed, and it could impact where they are today, because everything's just basically caught up.
I want to make sure anyone online would like to join us, and I'll just note really quickly for the record, we had 2 more members join us. We have Chief Shannon Anderson and Chief Jim Coleman have joined us as well. Thank you. Any thoughts on or any additional conversation on that? Okay. So I feel like we've come to a consensus that it would be appropriate to change the minimum ineligibility. Was it a consensus to open it all the way up to 0 to the maximums? A 0 minimum? Okay. All right. All right, should there be any changes to the maximum ineligibility periods? Well, I don't think you can increase lifetime. But are you finding that 10 years is sufficient for misconduct and misuse of authority for the cases that are going to the telecommunications, corrections, and police policy committees? Scotty?
Yeah, I mean, my 2 cents on it, I think that the cases that rise to that level are pretty cut and dried. I haven't necessarily seen an issue that the police policy committee has had in making those determinations. I think the less major cases are the ones that cause a little bit more complication. I think when you get up in the 10-year or lifetime, it's pretty egregious violations that the committee's pretty much everyone on there sees it. It's plain and simple. It's a major violation, and the person's not going to be in the career field anymore. So I personally I haven't seen it be an issue at this point. I don't know if someone else has further, but that's my 2 cents.
Sure, Brandenburg, for the record, I would agree with that. Seems to have been sufficient. It was more of the minimum time that we've struggled with for the policy committee. Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. So we'll talk a little bit about the applicant review committee. We may revisit it whenever we revisit the applicant review committee in total, because it might be easier as well then. But their time frame for ineligibility is 0 to 10 years, and their 10 years also reflected that it was looking at pre-employment criminal dispositions. So going beyond 10 years seemed to be too punitive. But is 10 years still the right timeline? Is it too much ineligibility period, or is it too much look back, or is it still just right?
What are you saying, it's going from 3 years to 10 years?
The-
There's nothing in between?
For the applicant review committee and those pre-employment criminal dispositions, they have a 0 to 10 year. So 10 is their max and 0 is their minimum. Is 10 still appropriate? Does it need to be raised or lowered? And I wouldn't raise it if you found that 10 was appropriate for the other ones, but does it need to be lowered, or is 10 still appropriate?
Carol Deshawn for the record, I know the time that I spent on the applicant review committee, I didn't notice that there was any struggle with that as far as people thinking that it needed to be changed. Has that come up recently?
Just asking questions.
Okay.
Okay.
Melissa Lane Bosher for the record. I just wanted to note that cases that already had the 10-year period of time expired didn't end up going to the committee for review. So they weren't cases that the ARC was actually reviewing. They were on ineligibility, or I'm sorry.
Because their time had already passed.
Right. So those cases would have been on inquiry closure memos and not the cases that the committee reviewed.
So not really hearing much about that right now. We'll continue on. Like I said, when we look at applicant review committee beginning to end, we'll ask again just to confirm. Let's see. So the next two, questions 3 and 4, when certification is denied or revoked and the public safety officer is currently employed, how should that affect their current employment in the application of the ineligibility period? And then are there any changes to the ineligibility period start dates that need to be considered? So if you have we have a recommendation for a broad ability to apply an eligibility period from 0 up to 10 or 0 up to lifetime, depending upon the moral fitness violations that occur. With criminal dispositions, our start date is the date of the criminal disposition. With separations, it's the date of separation. The gray area seems to be what happens when a person has either continued employment through the process or after some amount of time has gained reemployment. Does that need to be a factor, or is that complicating?
Rob Wood for the record. So back to my two-pronged issue right at the beginning is when someone in public safety, say a police officer, then moves into a telecommunicator position. The way I understand it, the ineligibility period starts when we as the policy committee make a recommendation and the board affirms it.
Yes.
So in that case, I think I would propose that gets changed. So the ineligibility period starts, I guess, at the date of separation from the previous. Yeah, I think that's the one place that would apply.
So only when they've changed disciplines from the
It would have to be a change of discipline, because I agree with Les earlier, if they go from police to police, or maybe police from corrections or something. But if they're taken off the street and the moral fitness violation occurred because it's something that happened on the street.
Scotty?
So I have more of a question. So let's say you have two people from the same agency involved in the same incident, essentially the same charges. One takes a different career path than the other. Are they going to be potentially subjected to different ineligibility periods based on these rules? That's where I see it could be somewhat unfair. Like, hey, I went to telecommunications, so now my ineligibility periods may start at a different time, or am I off base?
It is a potential.
Yeah, so that's where I would, if it needs fixed, you would try to standardize that, you know, this is the rules. this is when your ineligibility period starts, if that's possible. I know sometimes with criminal things it can be different, but regardless of what you do afterwards, your 3 years is 3 years, starting at the same time.
I'm gonna pose a question for Melissa and Jennifer. What?
Thank you, I was just
Oh,
about to if you weren't.
Okay, well, I don't know if it's gonna be the
okay.
same one. So whenever I was making my notes, I realized that a person could have a criminal disposition and remain employed the entire time their case is being heard.
Absolutely.
And so their ineligibility period is, because it's a criminal disposition, the date of the criminal disposition, and there's no punitive service of time away from doing their job, as there is in that concept of the separation of employment and you've gained. So we already have a bit of a disparity in what the moral fitness violation, how it came to be. And I didn't realize that until I was making my notes, and I thought, oh gosh, you can actually stay employed the entire time your case is going through its court process, getting to its criminal disposition, and then waiting for the case to come to the policy committee and being heard. You could be employed that entire time. Not every criminal process results in somebody being terminated from their employment. So just recognizing that. And so what were you going to say, Melissa?
Melissa Botch for the record. And so just to add to that, our administrative rules indicate that the conduct subject to discretionary review includes things like criminal dispositions and arrests and separations, but it's not limited to that. And so the ineligibility periods currently don't account for if we're just looking at someone's arrest or anything else that's not listed on here. But our rules allow for us to take action or to review the conduct. And so it sort of creates this uncertainty of when an ineligibility period would start if we were to look at something that's maybe not on the list or specifically.
Can you give an example? That might be helpful.
Well, there's a case that's scheduled for the PPC review where an officer had separated from employment in good standing, later got arrested, and all of those criminal charges, we had sufficient information to make findings based on them, but they did not result in a criminal disposition. So we're just looking at the conduct from the arrest, but because there wasn't a criminal disposition, which is what's listed in our ineligibility period start times, it's sort of not really certain which category it fits in.
And Captain Calvin, for the record, that would be along the same lines as those agencies who decide that through their internal investigation process may have enough information to make a determination, because the threshold is different, and may choose, depending on the seriousness of the allegation, may choose not to wait until the criminal disposition, which could be 6 months to 2 years down the road, and do that as well. Historically, we have, if the agency does not take action, we've waited on the criminal.
Mm-hmm.
And more, we're also seeing the sealing of records that make it even more challenging for us to take a look at the facts and circumstances.
I have a question, or I have a question, Kathy. Are you talking about when the agency doesn't take action?
Yeah, if the agency, just as we're gonna ride this out, right? You get your due process, we're not taking any internal action or looking into it. Most agencies bifurcate and some, but we have seen where some agencies don't open an internal and let the criminal process go.
Okay.
And the allegations could be serious and could actually be, mandatory or, decertification, but through the court process, maybe, they've been vindicated, right? They didn't rise to the level of a criminal guilty, but there are still facts and circumstances that administratively, both internally and through certification that could be looked at.
Right,
Um,
right.
That hasn't been the case unless it's been an internal investigation through an agency. DPSST historically has not, taken that investigative stance. Is that right, Melissa? Is that right?
Sorry, I got lost in that a little bit, but generally we're waiting for agencies or other investigations to look at, because we're not conducting our own. So if there's not an investigation done, that makes it really challenging for us.
Yes, the criminal disposition stands as is.
But I'm sorry, I blush over again. So, but there isn't, you wouldn't have a problem, say for example, because I've had the reverse experience where for some reason the court decided they didn't want to ruin this guy's career, so they just dismissed a clearly adequate charge, but at least it was adequate for our agency's requirements, and so we terminated the employee. You would then have no problem taking action on that, I'm assuming the facts supported that.
Right, and we still have the ability to look at the conduct during the arrest, and it would be probably a mitigating factor that the agency is retaining their employment. But our current ineligibility periods don't have a start date for just an arrest, because the dismissal of the case wouldn't be considered a criminal disposition. So we would, it's confusing for us, I think, internally.
So Captain Coffin, for the record, it's sounding like then, does it default to the administrative action? And I think that's where maybe perhaps you guys can discuss in that scenario, would that be the appropriate time or ineligibility period is the time that the agency had an action.
So that would be the outcome of the internal investigation.
In cases where the arrest is dismissed, the charges of the arrest are dismissed? Is that what?
Yes.
Okay.
Dismissed, settled, no
complaint.
Yeah.
I'm gonna insert that not every agency is going to do an internal investigation on the criminal disposition.
Yeah.
So in that sense, would it be appropriate that the date the court recognized it as dismissed could be the appropriate date?
I think any date that the workers would like to.
What about the date that DPSST becomes aware of, because you have to be, somehow you're gonna know about the investigations somehow, right? So if an agency is not doing an internal, then how would you be noticed on that?
That's my
Whether you find out through the media or, because you can open up cases via that as well if you, or somehow you got information from another complainant or from the agency to take a look at this case, because sometimes you get that as well.
Right.
So what about the date that DPSST is aware of the conduct and opens up a case?
I think sometimes if it's for criminal action, that court cases can take a really long time. So I just want to make sure that's considered.
I don't think we've had anything on the PPC since I've been on that applies this, but Les, you bring up something very important that, let's say, information or evidence is suppressed, therefore, but that evidence can be considered for us, for staff, and somehow staff finds out, I don't know how that would be. Are we creating now a fourth ineligibility period commencement date Because we don't have that right now when a discovery is made by staff. Could we go to the one that allows, when it's considered by the committee and then ratified by the board? As an alternative to what you said.
That makes sense.
So in the absence of a separation date, in the absence of a criminal disposition date, the matter defaults to the board approved date.
Have we had that before my time on the PPC? Has that occurred?
It would be difficult
There's
to
one
pinpoint.
scheduled for
There is, isn't there?
May.
Yeah, I know, okay, I know what that is. Yeah, okay.
Would it be important for the committee to know that in their discussion so that they're prescribing an eligibility period that corresponds with that effective date?
I think so.
Okay, we need to know so that they can look at it and know holistically
Okay.
and take that into consideration when deciding on how long to route.
Okay. Well, that doesn't get rid of that, that third board date like I want. But that's okay. We can maybe look at the language and make it a lot cleaner and clearer, more applicable. Does the staff have any other concerns about the third board date? Okay. All right. All right, thank you. Any other discussion about the start dates? Okay. All right. Should there be an opportunity to request reconsideration before an ineligibility period has passed? So, if a policy committee prescribes 10 years of ineligibility, should it remain as it is, the 10 years must pass before the individual can be reemployed and certified in public safety? Or should there be a process or timeline that would allow that person to come back before the 10 years and request reconsideration? Same would apply, I used the 10 years, but it would also apply, the next question is about lifetime, I think, so. You can talk about both of them if you'd like to.
Sure, Brandon, for the record, I think that we should rely on the committees to make the recommendations and to stick with that. So I think that's gonna create just a whole host of, I think, just staff issues for you to figure out what that process is, and there needs to be, as you said, delineation when the policy committee votes on something that is the minimum. That's just my preference. And if you get to 10 years, that's pretty egregious.
Yeah.
So.
10 years is never given out lightly by any policy committee, so.
Rob Wood, for the record, I would agree with Sheriff Brandenburg. The way I understand it, there is an appeal process right now, but that appeal has to occur pretty quickly after the board ratifies the decision. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
So they have that opportunity right now.
Yes, so the contested case process means that when the policy committee makes its recommendation, DPSST sends notice to the individual, and that notice outlines the moral fitness violations, the aggravating mitigating circumstances, and the prescribed the action to revoke or deny, and the ineligibility period. And as it's moving through the process with the board, the individual has the opportunity to request a hearing. That process doesn't necessarily have any change to the ineligibility period. It's a matter of did everything administratively occur correctly? Are the findings, can those be upheld by the administrative law judge? Any other descriptions of that contested case and what the possible outcomes of a contested case are? What's the outcome of a hearing? The administrative law judge can rule in our favor and.
Or against, and I think in rule, it actually says that they can't, the judge specifically cannot change the ineligibility period.
Correct. So it's whether the findings are appropriate or not, and whether the action is appropriate or not.
So I would agree again with Sheriff Brandenburg that I think it's opening a can of worms. You're gonna get everyone
Yes.
applying. Hey, can you look at me again? You can look at me
Yeah.
again.
Okay. The workload triples at that point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Other thoughts or discussion? Members online? Okay. Agreement? Okay, all right. Any other questions, concerns, or recommendations about ineligibility periods?
Yes.
Yes.
So this occurred during our last PPC, and I think I was the lone person on the island. If I knew that this person had been full Brady, is that something that we should take into consideration on ineligibility periods, or does it even matter if they're already been the full Brady? I don't know what you guys call it, red or whatever. That takes care of itself, or is that something that we should parallel our decisions?
I know historically from the advice that we've received in discussions with DOJ and in the past and past work groups and past committees is there can be a recognition of Brady perhaps as an aggravating circumstance, but basing your decisions on that length of ineligibility is not a good tie-in because every county administers Brady differently, and Brady can be subjective. So because of those subjectivities and the differences from one county to the next, there's no consistent standard. Therefore, it can be an aggravating factor, but it shouldn't be the thing that leads us one way or another.
So I didn't realize this. So if they're full Brady down in Lane County, they could be not on that list in Marion County. I did not realize that. Okay.
It's by the DA's decision.
Okay.
Yeah. And their sense of Captain Copine for the record, and also their duty under Brady to disclose this. So yeah, it can be definitely a factor for the employing agency. And then, if you can get to why they're being Brady, that in itself might be the dishonesty that an agency has made their determination on employment. But what we have seen an uptick on is DAs making that decision during testimony, and because now there's body camera that maybe conflicts with what the officer's report says, and so I've seen agencies or DAs that have put them on a different tiered Brady list and make it challenging, for the employing agency, but may or may not affect their ability to be a police officer in the state of Oregon.
Okay.
Scotty?
Everyone said what I was going to say, so I'm done. Thanks.
Any other questions or concerns or ideas about ineligibility? Okay. All right. That is one agenda item taken care of. All right. So let's take a look at the agenda item 3, recent legislation and current practices. This is another one that we've had on our agenda and carried over a couple of times. And you'll have to forgive me, this will be a lot of talking, but feel free to jump in with questions at any time. Really what I wanted to do with this agenda item is review the statutory requirements that came to us from the legislature over the past several years and how we implemented them. So how we interpreted and how we applied them and how we set them up. And then just if you had any questions or had any feedback on those or had any recommendations that you all wanted to discuss, then we would kind of put those forward. I didn't have any identified issues coming from us other than we just needed to make sure that everything looked like it was supposed to. So we'll go through. The first one is the statewide online database. And this came to us from House Bill 4207 in 2020. And it directed DPSST to establish a statewide online database of suspension and revocation of the certification of police officers and to make that database available to the public. So DPSST published a database on our website in July of 2020. And it's important to note that when we did that, we included not just police officers, but we included all of the disciplines. And that was an easy choice for DPSST to do because we process all of those denial and revocation actions for all of the disciplines through the policy committees and through staff. So we hold those records. So it was appropriate to go ahead and share all disciplines, not just the police officer disciplines. So when it began, it included the public safety officer, the certification action, the employing agency, and a link to the final order. So once everything was completed and the final order had been issued, which meant that it's been to the policy committee, it's been to the board, and it's been through its contested case process, the final order outlining what occurred. So in January of 2021, DPSST expanded the information that was available in the database. And that expansion included a list of all open professional standards cases, the status of each case as it works through the review process, and the corresponding DPSST report documents. The expansion of the database was in recognition of the importance of furthering transparency in the processes that were established to safeguard public safety accountability. Let's see. There's a note that the database was expanded in House Bill 3145 in 2021 to add the records regarding economic sanctions. And I'll touch more on that in the next couple of pages. But in general, about the database, entries in the database were currently scheduled to remain in the database for 5 years and then transfer over to a more archival format. That didn't mean that everything went away in 5 years. It was just what DPSST estimated that our website could manage with the technology that we had. So how many records could we upload, how much data could be housed, and that type of thing. So that's where the 5 years came from. It was just an estimate on what we could do. So again, the 5 years that it remains in the database is not dictated by statute, and it's based on what we were able to do. Right now, we're about 900 entries, and we're about to reach that 5-year mark. But I don't know if we've had the chance internally to discuss what to do at the 5-year mark, whether it's to get rid of the 5 years process and start archiving things in a different spreadsheet access or not. But it's a recognition. I'm rambling now. Okay. So there's lists on the next page that outline the different things. So the reasons for reporting. Entries in the database can be sorted by the reason for the entry. And so the reasons, the categories that we have are the academy dismissals, that arrest or criminal disposition, if it's a case that's open based on a complaint, if it's a record of an economic sanction, or whether it is a case that was open based on separation of employment. So we've got those designations. Then we have status designations. As the case moves through the process, the status and the documentation are updated by DPSST staff as time allows. So you have recognition that there are admin closures, that something may be in a contested case hearing process, if the final outcome is that it was denied, if DPSST has issued the final order, if there was no action taken, if the certification was revoked, if it was something that was for reporting only, something that's still under review. those types of things. And then the different types of documents that are housed in that database. So according to the status, what is the document that goes with it? Is it the administrative closure memo? Is it the staff report that DPSST have prepared? If it's just going to the committee, then it would of course be the committee report. If it's been through the committee, then it would be updated to the board report. The economic sanction is what's reported to DPSST from the employer. So that's just a very high level overview of the database, what's in it, why it's there. We can talk about each thing individually, or I can go through everything and then we can just have a big broad discussion. I think I'll do that. Broad discussion, great. Moving on. The next law that we're going to talk about is the report of discipline with economic sanction. House Bill 3145 from 2021. And that was establishing the requirement for the law enforcement units to report discipline of a police officer that includes an economic sanction and to send that report to DPSST. So the requirements that go along with that is that the report must be submitted to DPSST within 10 days of becoming final. So becoming final includes that all arbitration is complete. So all actions are complete at the employment level, and that's when the agency has 10 days to submit it to DPSST. If that law went into effect January 1st of 2022, and at the time the memo was prepared, there were about 50 reports that had been published in the database. There are no statutory requirements with that law for DPSST to review that discipline within the economic sanction or take action. That helps to continue to recognize that the person is still employed. And DPSST does its certification reviews at the time of separation of employment. So that separation between local authority and regulatory authority over the certification. Let's see. So when the report is sent to DPSST, it includes the name and the rank of the officer, the name of the law enforcement unit, and a description of the facts underlying the discipline imposed, including a copy of any final decision. So when DPSST receives it, we're required to publish the information in the database. We are required to do that within 10 days. And what we post to the database is the name of the officer, the name of the unit, and the letter that's submitted to DPSST with the underlying facts. We have a process on our website that says that the letter to DPSST on agency letterhead should include the name, DPSST number and rank, the description, and a statement indicating the officer's time to request arbitration is passed, so that we know that all of those employment things have been met. The letter is published to the database, and the final decision paperwork is added to the DPSST's officer file. So the third piece of legislation here is the failure to intervene or report, and that was House Bill 4205, also in 2020. It established a requirement for police officers and reserve officers to intervene to prevent or stop another officer from engaging in misconduct. It also established a requirement for those officers who witness misconduct to report the misconduct. And the bill itself defines what is considered misconduct in those situations. That bill, House Bill 4205, made a failure to intervene or a failure to report something that's grounds for disciplinary action, including disciplinary action from DPSST to be able to deny, suspend, or revoke certification. And in 2021, we submitted testimony on House Bill 2929, which was amending that definition of misconduct and the reporting options to the original bill. And DPSST's testimony provided the following interpretation. And this is how we've been applying the requirement. So based on current administrative rules, a DPSST certification review of an officer who fails who witnesses and fails to intervene would only occur if the witnessing officer's failure to intervene later resulted in criminal charges being filed, or the witnessing officer being separated from employment. So while the bill made it something that DPSST could take action on, our interpretation and application so far has been that we wouldn't take action unless it became something that was a separation of employment. That those were the reasons the person was separated from employment. So the changes that House Bill 2929 made to that reporting misconduct requirement is that it required that DPSST provide a form. So we expanded our standard complaint form to include information for the person to document that they are a police officer or a reserve officer reporting misconduct. When we receive the report gets forwarded to the employing agency for the employing agency to do its investigation as required by the statute. And then the employing agency is required to investigate any allegations of failures to intervene or report. They have 3 months to do their investigation, and that's by the statute. And then they have to notify DPSST what the investigation, when the investigation results in sustained findings. There's nothing that DPSST is directed to do with those sustained findings. So that is the high-end overview, and again, I apologize because that was just a lot of direct information thrown at you. But what kind of questions or concerns or ideas or recommendations do you all have?
Can I ask a clarifying, Sheriff Bradford, for the record? Because we had issues with the definition of police officer for the law enforcement and statewide conduct and discipline committee, is the same police officer definition for this, it precludes corrections, and this is this patrol officers in this definition for this House bill?
For economic sanction?
For
either.
or either, I think.
For either, yes.
For either.
Correct, yes. It does not. It is just the police officer. So.
It doesn't preclude an agency from making policy that sweeps, I think, both of them in, but the DPSST requirements around the reporting is police officers.
Captain McAlpin, for the record? Oh, thank you for bringing that up.
You're welcome.
Yes, we have been challenged right now with, we do have at least one identified agency that is sending us economic sanctions information for their corrections officers because it's in their policy. We have no ability to accept it, to retain it, to put it anywhere. And so I've just recently met with the sheriff with those challenges and requested a modification of their policy or keep it, until such time that we're asked to broaden this. But yes, compliance officers here are challenged with what do I do with it now because we don't take action and we don't have a place to put it. And what I am concerned that DPSST would be then the de facto keeper of records that are subject to public records requests, and we don't do anything with this. We have no statutory authority to do that. So that has been a challenge that I've seen in my first 3 months. So great question.
Les Youngbar, for the record, is it appropriate for, in this committee setting, to make a recommendation that staff seek some sort of legislative review of this? Because corrections should be in the middle of both these two things, especially failure to report or intervene. I don't really understand that at all. And I think, is this the place where we would say we're recommending that you go back and?
And Captain McAlpin, for the record, let me differentiate the two. I'm really talking about the economic sanctions.
Okay.
The duty to report and intervene kind of different, right? Because there's a process and investigative steps as it's already outlined, criminal charges or the agency separation. It's the economic sanctions where agencies have decided to keep that same threshold for the corrections. And the statute says police officers only are required, and so we have other additional information that is not required by statute. And we have not, and so Jennifer, I don't know the rules, but whether or not we can expand it by the agency's request, I don't know if that's one of the things to consider, but right now we're not putting it on the website for economic sanctions if they're not a police officer. So let me, separate the two.
Yeah, yes, flesh out more again. Yeah, my point is though, I think that there's a need, if we can just talk about the intervention part, you know, I think there's a need to include correction, that's all I'm saying. Officially, okay? It seems like you don't have that, and I think that might correction people even agree with that. I mean, you know, so.
100%.
Whatever's appropriate, or.
And that's the sheriff branding for the record for the statewide standard LESEC LESEC. So the statewide conduct of employee disciplinary conduct, I have to get in front of me, but it's a long one. And that was I believe the intent of the legislature was to have it be more broad, but the definition that they used really was very specific, and so they went back and they broadened that definition for that committee. And so I think it's about bringing out that the issue, you know, if we want that to be broadened, is to have DPSST take it back and ask that be taken back to the legislature.
Right.
To broaden the definition and who this affects.
Yeah.
So let's talk disciplines that we're going to talk about a recommendation. I'm hearing corrections, but we also have parole and probation, telecommunications, emergency medical dispatch, and OLCC regulatory specialists that fall under DPSST purview.
And instructors.
What's that?
And instructors.
And instructors. I'm thinking the LESC definition includes parole and probation officers.
It does, and I think it should be mirrored. I mean, it would make sense to mirror that, because it's the same conduct that we're talking about here.
Right.
Well, it was clarified through the process. But it was because the legislature had selected a specific definition to something in the statutes, which was, so it was clarifying.
And do you know, I mean, and I can look up myself, but I'll ask, but do you know if your definition excludes tribal?
I don't recall.
Okay.
I believe the discussion was to bring it all under the same umbrella.
Discussion or input online? Scotty?
Scotty Young for the record. I want to clarify, we're not talking about the economic sanctions part, correct? Just duty to intervene? Or are you talking about both?
I was talking about intervention, but I don't know about mine.
Couldn't hear you.
I think Les indicated he was specifically talking about to intervene. Sheriff, were you talking about only that or both?
I think it should be for both. I think it should.
that it's appropriate to have all economic sanctions reported and posted.
I mean,
all disciplines.
we're talking about transparency and what the public wants to see, and
Right.
there's a very, another very bright line between corrections and police officers on the street.
Okay. I would disagree with that. I think, especially if there's not a limit on the economic sanctions. Police officer, for example, could not get reports done, and you get a written reprimand, and the next time you get a few hours off, and now you're not only being sanctioned a few hours off, but you're being essentially put on blast on the internet and says, hey, here's what happened. It's a very unique thing to law enforcement. I understand that law enforcement is a special career field, but it's a big step from a written reprimand to having your discipline put on the internet. There are certainly some violations that I think warrant that, but just to say economic discipline. So I would imagine, I don't know, but I would imagine agencies are probably not doing economic discipline when maybe historically they might have, because it is it's now a much bigger hammer essentially than it used to be to give someone a few hours off work.
Catherine Calpine for the record. Scotty, I think I'm not following. I just want to make sure. So on the table is still what rises to the level of economic sanction. I think the recommendation, so that stays as is. The recommendation was to expand it to other disciplines. So just outside of police officers, but all the other disciplines would then be required to report economic sanction violations. So definitely not the written reprimands, but the economic sanctions, but now including the other disciplines.
No, I understand. That's what my hesitant to expand it further is because there's not a minimum. So when you go in your progressive discipline, you go from written reprimand essentially to kind of the next step is time off for unpaid economic sanction, I guess is what we're talking about. So there's not a minimum on that. So I just, like I said, it's not our choice because it's obviously in statute, but I wouldn't be in favor of recommending it further without having some sort of minimum amount on there. Does that make sense?
Catherine Calpin, yes. In the last 3 months, I have had agencies reach out to see if the legislature had defined what constitutes economic sanctions. And I've had discussions with Jennifer on that to see, because to give an example, I was always growing up in, law enforcement was anything that, was a day off or greater. But the legislature intentionally did not define economic sanctions, and so it's left to each agency to determine what economic sanction is, which I suppose also could be your removal of a specialty unit that has 5%, and now you're just going back to a different assignment. Is that economic sanctions for the purpose of this? So, and Scotty, so I think what you're saying is we haven't even defined what the minimum is, so before we expand it to other disciplines, we should understand what the minimum reporting requirement is. Am I following you finally?
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, if someone gets 1 hour off, or like you said, I think that certainly in the labor arena, someone would argue if you lost your position and lost 5% incentive to go back, out of that assignment, that would be an economic sanction. So was that the intention that now your information is going to be put out there that says, hey, you screwed up at work and now the whole world gets to know about it? So unless there was some sort of better definition on it, or maybe higher ceiling, because I think usually the discipline that would come with a week off or 2 weeks off or a serious economic discipline is probably more of the intention of that. That's probably more the usual discipline that people want to see. That's my opinion. So.
Thank you.
So there seemed to be consensus on finding out what the steps or the process would be to expand the current statutory authority for duty to intervene and duty to report misconduct to apply to all of the law enforcement officer disciplines, so police, corrections, parole, and probation. Heard that. Not something that we would necessarily have to apply to all public safety officers, so not necessarily applied to tele EMD. And I just don't know if OLCC is in the definition that's used for LASC, but I'll look to that definition.
DOJ investigators too, I think
Okay.
there were some other pockets of.
Okay,
of
then it probably does, yeah, okay. All right, so I can find out what those steps and that process would be and report back on what that is. I don't know what to do about economic sanctions.
Captain Copeland, for the record, any of the other people either online or in this room have a thought, because we've had a couple thoughts of possibly expanding to other disciplines, and then of course you have one school of thought that, hey, before we expand it, we don't even know what the minimum reporting is for economic sanction. I don't know, and I guess first I'll ask Jennifer, was it intentional by the legislator to keep it vague on the definition to make it to each agency, or can this group also make a recommendation of economic sanctions, before we even think about expanding it? So first, can we even recommend defining economic sanctions, or in this group?
I would want to look at the statute
Okay.
again further. My inclination is that there was no intention to give us any type of rulemaking
Okay.
authority for it.
Perhaps again, it's left to each discipline to understand how they administer economic sanctions or discipline. Anybody else have thoughts or concerns about expanding the economic sanctions to other disciplines? Scotty, do you have a new comment? Okay. All right, hearing none, we have both perspectives. Jennifer, do you have what you need?
I'll speak up, Rob, with the record. I agree with Sheriff Brandenburg, and transparency is very important. So I think we should expand it to all, but I'm also gonna agree with Scotty that somehow we need to have a definition of what is an economic sanction, because you could be pulled off FDO status because of personality conflict and lose that 5% bump. Is that something we wanna put out there and have burden the staff with, burden the agency with sending a form in, and then publicizing that? And if I understand you, Kathy, that agencies are left to define it on their own. So some agencies may turn that in as an economic sanction, and some may say, no, it's a week or longer, unpaid. So that's the way it sits right now?
I've had agency heads reach out to me and say, under this House bill, what is the definition of economic sanction? And I phoned Jennifer to see, I tried to go historically to see if they defined it or at any time in their conversations. I couldn't find any. I asked Jennifer, and she too said I think it was intentionally vague because economic sanctions could look a little different. So just because I say anything that has a monetary value, a day off or greater is how I would apply it in my agency, may not be the same application somewhere else. So as it stands, it's left for the agencies to define economic sanction and then follow the rules of reporting it.
And Sheriff Brandenburg, again, we may want to go back to the legislature and ask them for clarification on definition. And I don't know if there's anything in labor relations that defines economic sanctions that everyone uses broadly.
Well, like a bully.
definition or something there.
Something we can point to that's there that we can all reference.
Thank you. Chief Anderson?
So I muted myself. I also wanted to add that I think it's a good idea to get ahead of and be transparent, to have the other disciplines join us in this reporting. It allows us to do what's right before it's demanded of us. And then I think they're two separate things. We have to work with the legislation in which there is, but how do we modify that? How do we kind of make it better so that we all understand it? And then also, how do we expand the other disciplines into that reporting? So I think they're two different distinct subjects, just related.
Thank you. Any other discussions?
I have a quick question about, so economic sanctions, Sheriff Brandenburg for the record, that come to DPSST, so by agencies. There's no requirement for DPSST to investigate or to identify potential misconduct. Do you look at that at all? Is it something that, how does that work with identifying potential misconduct that you're made aware of through this economic sanction reporting?
Sure. The statute is directing DPSST to receive it and to publish it.
Okay.
So it does not currently fall under any of our administrative rule practices for reviewing as a circumstance in which we would review the conduct to determine whether it's a moral fitness violation or not. So that's the current practice. That if there were other discussions or recommendations that needed to be considered, we could receive those. And I think we're still trying to figure out process-wise, if we have a separation of employment, do we look back and bring up the history as information that's presented to the policy committee whenever the case for the separation goes forward? And by the way, we had this complaint and we had this economic sanction, just as history. Is that, I know that's something that we've talked about in the past.
Correct, yeah. And I think that's in administrative rule, that there's nothing that precludes the committee from looking at prior conduct. And I think that the clarification that I wanted to add was that the current administrative rules give a list of circumstances, but it specifies it's not limited to those things. So if the Workgroup or board wants us to look at economic sanctions, then there is room for that.
Jennifer has it.
Jennifer, you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, just to add to what Melissa says, it says when the department receives information from any source that a certified public safety professional, blah, blah, blah. This is when you're opening a case. So it's confusing as a compliance coordinator to have language that says any source when opening a case. And then under misconduct, it also says conduct identified through receipt or discovery of information that would lead an objectively reasonable person to conclude that the public safety professional violated board established employment training or certification standards. So to me, that's a broad enough definition of here's other places you can look for misconduct, but we haven't, as compliance coordinators, we haven't really understood our role in defining that. So any help from the committee, from the work group would be appreciated with those two things.
So that is a helpful thing to recognize. So we do have some broad language that would allow us to. And we haven't yet, because that language existed, predates the requirement to report these economic sanctions. And it hasn't been held up in a committee or a work group as a should DPSST or shouldn't DPSST. So historically, we've still been taking the line of unless it's a separation of employment. But that's part of the reason for the overview and discussions today. Do you have thoughts?
Well, Sheriff Brandenburg, I think it's, if you can get information from any source, but yet you get these reports from law enforcement agencies when they're reporting things that are economic sanction worthy, that you would not be, I don't know, taking a look at those. It seems to me this is information that's available to you, and if you saw something that you thought was potentially violating the misconduct or, the DPSST rules, do you just not address that at all? I mean, have there been cases where you've seen economic sanctions reported to you that you went, this is something that we should bring forward? And I don't know. I think you said there's maybe 50 cases that you have, and maybe you haven't, and maybe it's not an issue. I just thought it was interesting that you can take complaints from everyone, yet you feel precluded from opening up a case based on these reports from agencies. And I don't know if it's a problem or not.
Well, Kathy McAlpine, for the record, again, as I'm reviewing our do's and don'ts, it has been only those who've been separated. And so anything that's happened just short of that, whether it hits the media or not, has been how the agency has decided to handle it. So assuming they do their investigation, they decide that maybe it's 30 days off, maybe it's 2 weeks off. It may fit in one of these categories, but they've decided the information is such that doesn't rise to them terminating the individual. Then it just goes in the economic sanction database, and there it sits for everybody to see. But we don't get to pull it out and basically question the agency head on why, and the authority of DPSST and the committees is not to do anything outside of, basically who's been separated from employment. So we haven't, even though it kind of alludes that we could, there is no past practice that says that we will, or no direction from anybody asking us to expand our authority. And so the discussions I've had internally is, well, certainly, again, most agencies, but I have to remember, not all large agencies, would put in the conduct of past performance, past discipline, which should acknowledge anything that's been on the economic database that led to why you're probably terminating this person this time. But not every agency has maybe professional standards or internal affair. They may or may not add that information. And so there, what I would say is the agency is now terminated. We can definitely put as other information to consider that on such and such a day they received economic sanction. So if it's not included in the agency head's write-up for final decision making, there's another place that we can put it and have in the past on occasion said, oh, by the way, they've had this previous conduct that rose to the level of economic sanction. So that's kind of, and again, Jennifer and Melissa, add more to it. Jennifer, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I was just going to say, partly we haven't actually been reviewing economic sanctions. It's a fairly new thing that's come across our plate, and we have 300 cases on the books right now. So it hasn't been a practice of ours, but it's definitely been something Melissa and I have talked about. I've seen economic sanctions, though, that have come across the desk that are terminations as well as economic sanctions. So I don't actually know what the economic sanctions contain, but for me it would be, because I can't investigate this information any further because we don't have the resources to do that. Is there substantial evidence within this economic sanction for me to move forward on it? That would be the first thing I would be considering. So partly it's the struggle I have is that when I see it, I can't unsee it. And then the other struggle is I don't have the resource to really forward it to an investigation. So those are just thoughts that I wanted to bring to the table. I don't know that there's a solution actually, but It's kind of new stuff that we're working through what to do with.
Melissa Langbacher for the record. I think just to add to that, the time that I know that I have used an economic sanction for moral fitness professional standards review involved an officer who was arrested, but it didn't result in a criminal disposition, and his agency reviewed that conduct and submitted an economic sanction to DPSST with relation to the conduct of the arrest. So it was all in the same sort of line, and their outcome from their review of the situation that we were already looking at. Yeah.
So we brought the information forward based on the arrest, and it was supported by existing economic sanction. It's challenging because I would say that every economic sanction at least meets the minimum threshold for the definition of misconduct, which would be threatens or harms the efficient operations of the agency.
Right.
But so it would be challenging to weigh and measure that on when it is more than that and would need additional review. It would be challenging. Doesn't mean it can't happen or be discussed, but if, as staff have indicated, we would need more resources.
Kathy Fink for the record. Just a question, making sure I'm tracking and clarifying. When we were discussing, or you were discussing the inclusion of additional disciplines, I kind of heard a couple things, to include all and to include part. So I'm just looking for, are we still looking at to include all? If not, why? For each of these two things, for the reporting of the economic sanctions and for the duty to intervene or report.
I thought I heard all. Isn't that what your proposal was?
I think it should be in line with the committee, the LESEC committee definition to, I think, make it, same.
And which I think in LESEC does not include telecoms or, so again, that's why I was trying to bifurcate the two, because if you're saying for just reporting economic sanctions and transparency, maybe that's all disciplines across the board to include telecom, AD, but the duty to intervene, duty to report stays within the definition of LESEC. Is that
The requirements of,
And so what would be helpful is to bring back the information at a future meeting to lay it all out on a piece of paper. This is this definition, and it applies to this conduct, and this is this definition, and it applies to this conduct, so that people can see it all put together. But, before we take any final action or steps to move forward. Scotty.
So, but the statute for duty to intervene doesn't apply to those folks. I mean, the statute is for police officers and reserve officers. So, I mean, are we expanding what I mean, the statute is what the statute is, and I think that we should apply this to other folks. I think that might be a little out of our purview.
And that's part of
I think someone should call the investigator if that's what they want to do, but I don't think that's where I think we're getting a little bit, unless I'm misreading the statute, but I have it in front of me, so.
Right. No, the current statute for duty to intervene and duty to report is specific to police officers and reserve officers. And the discussion has been whether or not to recommend expanding that to additional disciplines that would mirror the definition of that used for the law enforcement standards of conduct and discipline. That would include corrections, probation.
Okay, so this committee is trying to recommend a legislative fix or an expansion of the legislation? Is that?
Potential, yes, as a discussion.
Okay.
Kathy McAlpin for the record. I think, Scotty, the way I interpret it is this work group has brought up concerns, or would like to see it expand or modify, and some of these fixes would require legislative action as opposed to, recommendations to the board. And so we'll delineate, if we were to move forward on something, is this outside of board action versus this would require a legislative fix. So I think you're right on identifying how, if we were to take these forward, how would they be fixed? And some are gonna be at this level, and some would have to require it at the legislation.
Great, thank you for clarifying.
Do we have time for any more, or are we at our time?
Yeah, could I ask a question about the database?
Yes.
I know that I've received phone calls from officers where we haven't taken action in their case, who were looking for a way to appeal or request that their records have be removed from the database when there's no action taken. The other category of people who I didn't see listed are officers where we've deferred the review of their case. So no action has been taken and no review has been conducted. We have an open case, but it's essentially put to the side until they're reemployed. Does the work group, or is there any reason why we should take information down, I think is the question.
Sheriff Brandenburg, for the record. I think if there's no action taken, it was a review, that I would say that the record should not be on the website. There should be either a challenge process or a matter of practice.
But the second part of your question was, Rob Wood, for the record, the ones that haven't yet been reviewed, like they show up on the website as you are under review for a very long time.
There's another category for ones where we can't review them because they're not employed, and so they're listed as deferred. But it still shows that there's a professional standards case pending for them, essentially.
In that case, which was on our last agenda, we talked about the possibility of that individual applying to be heard to open a case, so they could be reemployed. So maybe leave that one. Maybe I would suggest we leave that one on the website, but I agree with you. If no action was taken, I think it probably should be pulled off.
Scotty?
Yeah, I mean, I guess my question was, what's the purpose of the question I would have is, what's the value of leaving it if there was no action taken? If they've gone through their due process and no action was taken, what's the value of leaving it other than, like I said, it's very challenging to in the career field, and transparency is very important, but also these are human beings we're talking about, and the internet is not a great place sometimes to put in information, especially if it's been vetted by these different committees that have been formed and have decided that this doesn't warrant action, then we probably should take it down. Just to protect the person's privacy to what extent we can.
All right, Captain Calpine, for the record, not a devil's advocate, but I'll just put there, the current policy has been since the creation that once it's open, so it's been followed along in the different statuses, and then no action is the final outcome of this process. So just again, walking through that, so if somebody's watching, looking, and do you send the final story of no action, it's there, and see what the committee did as transparency, or does it go away completely because there was no action, and then there's inquiries as to what really happened to this case? So just pros and cons of because we do open it up and we do allow that open transparency before any due process has ever happened, which always caused me concern, but we opened them up, let them go through all the stages, and then if the final outcome is no action, is it better for the employee to see that no action was taken versus it's just gone away? And so I'm just putting that out for consideration for you guys to think about that, because we are putting it in just as soon as we open a case.
Carol, Deshawn, for the record, then at that point, do we look at the possibility of a timeline so that that transparency is still there, that people can still look and see that no action was taken, but after a certain amount of time it's removed? So it's just not there indefinitely?
The 5 years.
Sheriff Brandenburg, for the record. So that case though, by the very nature of county DPSST is a matter of public record, is it not?
Right.
Yes. So I think it's there. So if someone really wanted to know, they could ask for it. But if there's a notice of it was reviewed and no action was taken, which says it's there, would that suffice though? So there's a record that was reviewed, it was no action taken, but someone who really was interested in it, instead of clicking the records to get them, would have to file that request of DPSST.
So there's just no report posted, just a listing of the review occurring.
Wait a minute.
Oh, we have a couple hands.
Wait a minute.
Go ahead, Scotty.
Oh, I think it's.
Okay. Jennifer?
I don't know how I have two hands up there, but I just wanted to ditto what Sheriff Brandenburg said. That one option is to just have it say no action and to not have reports posted.
Would that apply to administrative closures as well? So an administrative closure is basically a no action finding as well. It means that information was reviewed, but no action was taken.
I would think so. Carol Deshawn, for the record, sorry. I would think that no action, in my mind, no action is no action. So administrative closures, you guys review them, you bring them to the policy committees. The policy committees agree that they're administratively closed. At that point, I would agree that they should both be treated the same.
And Captain Cowboy, for the record, I think I would hope it would meet the transparency, because as just a reminder for anybody listening in, all of these are recorded, so the action, the discussions the board have is there for anybody to listen to and can have that information. So it's not like we are not providing that information. It just maybe doesn't meet the criteria of being on the spreadsheet for 5 years.
Right. And it is still, the public records are still public records. They're still available through public records requests. So that's.
Flesh on what record. So this listing, does it have a retention period under public records law?
The public records themselves are part of the officer's file, and the officer's file is retained for 50 years after they're deceased.
Yeah, I'm talking about the list that you're going to modify.
The list is only as big as we can manage it on the website.
Okay.
Right now it's designed for 5 years.
Okay.
But then you can click to a archivable spreadsheet that would show it. So as I've told people, it never goes away.
Yeah.
But it's how much is in that first scrolling down before I have to go to a more expanded historical spreadsheet.
Okay. So my point was, you're not going to get in any kind of issue if you modify it or change it because it's outside that. It's outside the retention requirements or inside the retention.
Correct. We're not changing anything about the public records law or the retention. No. Correct. All right. Any other final thoughts or questions as we get ready to wrap it up? We only have 7 minutes left in our allotted time, so we will not start a new memo. All right, next meeting, this is May. So we'll try to get another one scheduled for June, so that we can tackle these and the next things that come our way.
And Captain McCollum, for the record, again, I just appreciate all of you showing up, engaging in these dialogues. It really does help us as we try and navigate and hopefully clarify some rules down the road. But we couldn't do this without your input and participation, so I know sometimes it's a heavy ask, but I think we have tremendous momentum, and so I look forward to seeing you guys in June.